Welcome to the video devotion for Friday. Today we're going to be in Joshua chapter 5. And this is an interesting text. I want to start by reading it and then we'll talk about it. So it starts at verse 10 of chapter 5 of Joshua. While the Israelites were camped in Gilgal on the plains of Jericho, they celebrated Passover on the evening of the 14th day of the first month. The very next day, they began to eat unleavened bread and roasted grain harvest from the land. No manna appeared on that day, the first they ate from the crops of the land, and it was never seen again. So from that time on, the Israelites ate from the crops of Canaan. So isn't this fun and interesting that as soon as they get into the promised land, the manna stops because they could eat the grain off the land. Of course, it wasn't grain they planted, more than likely, but they could finally eat regular bread and use regular grain. And so then the manna stops. That's the way God is, isn't He? He gives us what we need when we need it, and no more and no less. So there you go. But what's interesting to me here also is this Passover. So now they have just come into the promised land and they are celebrating Passover. And if you think about Passover, what is Passover? Well, Passover was when they left Egypt, the night before they left Egypt, the night that the firstborn child died, except for the people that had put blood over the doorpost, and the angel of death passed over those households, which are mostly Jewish, some non-Jewish, some friends of Jews also did that, and passed over those doorposts, did not kill the firstborn child. That's why they call it Passover. Well, in order to put the blood of the lamb over the doorpost, you have to have lamb. So that night they ate lamb, and they ate unleavened bread, the bread that they would have when they were not able to let it rise because they were on the move all the time. So bread that didn't have yeast in it. And they had this meal. And in the meal, the Jews have been celebrating this meal every year since. And it's a wonderful meal. If you get a chance to go to one, go. But it's it has the stuff that reminds them of their hardship in Egypt. I've talked about this before, but it has the things that they would eat that would remember what it was like back in Egypt before God rescued them. Well, this Passover meal gets celebrated a lot at key and important times. For example, of course, I just talked about the Exodus, and it happens kind of when something new's happening, when the old is going away and something new is happening. So, for example, the Exodus, Joshua, as they're leaving the 40 years of desert life of traveling, of Exodus, and they're moving into the new promised land that God had given them. So they're moving from something old to something new, and they celebrate the Passover because that's what you would do, because that's kind of the symbolic meal of moving from something old and bad to something good and centered on God. After Josiah's reforms, they celebrate Passover. So from the not really paying attention to God, to Josiah introducing the law of God and other things of God, they celebrated the Passover, something old to something new dependent on God. Hezekiah restores the temple worship, and they celebrate the Passover, moving from something old and bad to something new and God-centered. And then when the temple was built for the first time, they celebrated Passover because they had a tent of meetings, and now they had an actual building. But there's one of the most important transitions where the Passover is celebrated, and that is the night before Jesus was killed, when the disciples and Jesus got together and celebrated the Passover, that meal, because now we have a transition from the old Adam, the old life, to the new that Jesus is going to bring. Now, it'll be his death, it'll be his resurrection that'll bring this new life, bring the Holy Spirit to us. And so they celebrate the Passover to remember the old life that we have and the new life that we have in Jesus Christ through the power of the Holy Spirit. This is what the Jews did when something old was going away and something new based on God, centered on God, was coming. And certainly that applies to Jesus, who saves us from ourselves, who saved us from the old Adam of sin and death and the devil, to he becomes the new Adam that is the one who perfectly fulfills God's will, God's law, and God's righteousness. And then he gives that to us as a gift. And so the Passover is important. It should be important to Christians as well, because we can eat the Passover meal and remember our old life before Christ and the new life that Christ brings. That Passover meal is a pretty important thing. And maybe it's about time for the church to bring it back into the Christian church as well. Well, God bless. I hope that was a helpful thought to you. At least the very thought of bringing, God brings new out of old, new out of bad, helps and saves us in the midst of hard times. And maybe today you are in the midst of hard times. And remember that God is the one who brings us out of hard times into the new. So be looking for the new today that Christ is bringing in your life, as well as the old that, we're all experiencing right now with this virus and all that it brings. God bless, and have a great weekend. And go worship somewhere, at least either online or in person. And you can worship at Bethel at www.bethelwindsor.com. And I hope you will. God bless.